Most people are obsessed with Barbie in the box office this weekend and exactly how woke it is. But I instead opted to go see a very much not woke movie of Oppenheimer, and I am pleasantly surprised. Not just because it was a great movie, great actors, great visuals, but also because of the deep legal bombshell, which frankly surprised me that was part of the movie. That there was a significant legal element to this, and that it was very much true to today, even in a way that I think perhaps the actors, the director did not even realize how deep of a legal point they were making when they included this as a very significant part of the movie, as a very large part of the movie. So we're going to get into that with the movie review today. Of course, this is a movie review, but as Oppenheimer is about history, I'm not going to say really whether it's spoilers or not spoilers. I mean, all of this stuff is in the historical record. We kind of know how it ends because, well, we're in the future today. So I will say, look, I'm going to just discuss the movie honestly, openly. If you like that, you want to hear my review, you can stick around. If you want to stay completely spoiler-free for the movie and for history because you're ignorant, well, then you can tune out, go watch the movie, and check back in. Of course, I'm Andrew Esquire, Florida attorney living over here in Bangkok, Thailand. And this is a legal mindset where we teach you to be your own judge. I had the pleasure to watch the movie here in Bangkok at the Siam Paragon in IMAX, the 70 millimeter IMAX. Beautiful screen, very large screen, completely packed theaters. So even over here in Thailand, it was completely packed. And I know there were some rumors about Japanese avoiding it or whatever else. The area I live in and also the area where it was, a lot of Japanese folks. There were Japanese folks in the theater. And I'll just say from the outset, in terms of that whole controversy, I think it was done in a respectful way, in an accurate way. And I think when you do things historically, it's all right. And I think that's the thing that the woke people get wrong. It's what they try to do is pervert history, change history. They try to gender swap, race swap, sexuality swap. If you keep it raw, you keep it how it actually was. The characters were how they actually were because there was a war on. They were not friendly. They were not all love and peace and hugs with the Nazis, the Germans, or the Japanese, right? They were at war. They also weren't very friendly with the Russians. They knew that the Cold War was a coming, and they were playing kind of, we're frenemies with the Russians, which is very accurate to history, is very accurate to how things were. Yeah, they were collaborating, they were kind of pushing towards the same goal in Europe, but they knew as soon as they met, they would then be at odds. They knew that Stalin was a potential problem after the war. That was something that was known. So let me talk about the acting. Mr. Cillian Murphy, and yes, I had to look up the pronunciation of his name. He does an excellent job as playing Robert Oppenheimer. I think he really looks and feels the part. The costuming was great in terms of wardrobe. It really felt like watching this movie, I was back in the 40s, 30s, 50s. You really felt the era. You felt it in the way it was filmed. I think it was filmed in a genuine way that brought you back into that environment. Now, before anybody says anything, okay, were there any woke elements of the movie? Were there any things you could pick out? The only minor things I could pick out were some of the classrooms seemed like they may have been a little bit more diverse than reality. Okay, who's studying physics in America in the 1930s and 1940s? Was it really looking like the Village People? Well, not as much as perhaps some of the classroom scenes. If you really pay attention, try to portray it, but that's okay. It didn't distract from the film, it didn't overwhelm. And there weren't other things that they brought in that weren't there. For example, there is a female physicist that's part of the Manhattan Project, but in fact there was a female physicist that is part of the Manhattan Project. That's not something that is kind of brought in out of nowhere. And certainly it isn't this huge woke element that they try to make some strong female empowerment message in the movie. In fact, I think there's many raw elements to this that kind of treat this as it was in the era. One thing I actually liked was portraying all the characters as flawed individuals. There are folks that are hooking up in Robert Oppenheimer. He's a little bit of a ladies' man. He's a little bit of a person with a lot of moral wiggle room, as he says in there. So he's hooking up with people's wives. He's, flirting with other folks that are married. Clearly that's his vice. And look, I can identify with like a man who's got that vice, has a vice for the ladies. And it's there, it's raw. There is a sex scene with Miss Dumont, and they keep it pretty spicy. I mean, it gets pretty spicy pretty quickly. And there's a scene where they're just kind of sitting around, and you see a lot of flesh. You see her there topless, just kind of talking to Oppenheimer. Now, I know some other people might have a problem with this. Will say, "Hey, was it really necessary? Like, if you put a T-shirt on or a shirt on, then it's not going to be rated R." I don't have a problem with it because it's the raw emotion and the raw sensuality and the nakedness. I think the nakedness is a metaphor for just the way you're laid bare in front of the universe, laid bare to these concepts, laid bare to the truth. I think there's a lot of metaphors there. I was okay with it. I know some people may object to it, but hey, it's fine. And frankly, with all the woke movies that have male, nudeness and male eye candy, it's always refreshing to say, okay, there's a movie here that's got an attractive female, and they're still kind of showing that. It's still out there for people to see. I think that's actually a really interesting part of the movie. I also think it was a very interesting counter to Oppenheimer in Robert Downey Jr.'s Strauss. Strauss was very well played by Robert Downey Jr. In fact, it took me a while to realize that Robert Downey Jr. was playing the character. So that means he did a pretty immersive job. It took me a second to land it, but then his voice finally got to me, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's Robert Downey Jr. So very excellent portrayal there. Also, they did a really good job of portraying the kind of multi-ethnic coalition of physicists. The physicists that were in America weren't just American. They were German, they were Italian, they were from all over the world. There were all these people from all over the world that came to America to make this happen. I think that was super cool in how they portrayed that. They also really did an accurate job of portraying the post-war era and this post-war McCarthyism era. I think that's a very important thing to portray accurately, and that's actually the framing of the entire thing is, okay, we're looking back. We're in the McCarthy era. We're moving to the McCarthy era, and we're looking back upon World War II. And I think that's a very poignant thing, particularly in today when we're now looking back into, okay, what happened in the early 2000s, what happened in the 1990s, 80s, where we look back and we kind of judge that. There's really a metaphor there of the 50s looking back at the 40s, looking back at World War II, and then judging it in hindsight, judging the associations in hindsight. Even stuff from before World War II, like the Spanish Civil War. And to bring up the topic of communism, I think a lot of people may think of it in the black and white way, but I think there's a very active movie, and it kind of progressivism and liberalism, and it can even be paralleled in today's modern politics. When people are young, when they're in college, when they're in that environment, yeah, they're thinking of new ideas, they're doing new things, and of course, they've got these utopian dreams to make the world a better place and make things, equal for all, and fight back against fascism and totalitarianism. That's all well and good, but many of the characters, they come to the realization that that's not actually what communism ends up doing, and they end up distancing themselves from that. While they were open to communism in the Spanish Civil War era because it was viewed or perceived as a backstop against fascism, so they're funding, saying, hey, we're going to fund the Spanish Republic to stop Franco, to stop the fascists. They quickly get away from it when they're asked more. They're asked, hey, now we want you to aid Russia. Now we want you to aid the Soviet Union. They go, okay, well, hold on. I was here for the intellectual arguments. I was here for, the will of the people and all that. But now you're asking us to aid the Russians, totalitarian dictators, Stalin. We're going to back off from that. So it's very interesting to see people's relationship change. And I kind of view this in the modern parallel of, for example, for myself, Obama. Many people fell into the hope and change, and that's great, myself included. But kind of backing away from that, getting off of that and saying, wait, these people aren't delivering, and it's now become this perverse, crazy thing, which is not what anybody signed up for at all whatsoever. It's now become something that you wholly want to distance yourself from. So I think that parallel is very real as well. The visuals were absolutely stunning, whether it's the stars, the atoms, just the way they cast it. It felt very real, very raw. I think they filmed it in a way that really engages you. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of VFX. Of course, some of the scenes have to have effects, of course, but it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel fake. It feels, it really draws you into the story, into that era. And while I was watching it, I came out feeling like I experienced the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it makes you empathize with that time differently and the way people thought because of that existential threat of the Nazis, the Japanese, and the Russians, right? Because of those threats, they're like, we have to do this. We have to push for this greater good. And, there's a lot of characters in there, historical characters, that I'm glad got the screen time that perhaps they never would in another film, right? You have Heisenberg, Einstein, Bohr, people that you wouldn't think to see in Fuchs, you wouldn't think to see in other paradigms. You're not going to see, you might read about them in a book. And certainly I, read up about history. I'm a big history nerd. I knew about the Manhattan Project. I knew what went on. So none of these characters was a surprise to me from history, but it's nice seeing them in the big screen, seeing somebody that represents those characters, right? That you can see and say, okay, they're playing this historical character. And things are going to happen. You know how history goes, right? When Oppenheimer meets Heisenberg, that, hey, one of them's going to end up working with the Nazis, one of them's going to end up on this other side. So it's very interesting to see that play out. And frankly, I think that was one of the dichotomies, just seeing history on screen, that was worth it for me. Seeing Truman, think of Oppenheimer as kind of a pussy and a crybaby. I think that was hilarious. And just seeing the different tact of the different people because of their different backgrounds, where they were coming from, maybe whether they had more pacifist or more aggressive leanings. That was very interesting and very real, because people at that era were coming from so many different backgrounds to America and bringing so many different things to America, all of which were melting together, but also pushing against each other in an open but civil conflict, right? So not ending up in civil war or open conflict in America, but they were coming together, clashing, but they were doing it for the greater good of the country. So definitely something that was inspiring in that sense. In terms of the female politics and everything else, I think Emily Blunt did an excellent job as Oppenheimer's wife, as Kitty Oppenheimer. Definitely not what you would call a strong female character. Wasn't someone that had no flaws. In fact, a very flawed character, but that made her an amazing character. And this is what I think they need more of in Hollywood. They need more characters like Emily Blunt's character that's just real and raw and flawed and emotional. And there's times in which, she's drinking too much or doing things she shouldn't do. Or, there's one scene, and this is a bit of a spoiler here, guys, but I'm going to give the spoiler, where it shows, and I can't believe they did this in 2023, where it shows her ignoring the baby. And I'm like, oh, wow, they're going to show that happens. I mean, and of course there's repercussions for that. There's fallout for that. But, the baby's crying in the background. She has a mom is ignoring it. I think mothers out there can identify. That's a powerful thing to do. And it sends a message about the character. And I think a lot of films are afraid to send those messages about women and show women as, hey, being flawed. Like, this woman has a flaw. She has a lot of redeeming qualities, but they show her flawed. But I think that makes her a better human and a more realistic portrayal. That made the movie better, not worse. It made it more convincing for me. That made me up my rating of this story, because they're showing people, warts and all, they're showing people as deeply flawed individuals. Some people have deep psychological issues, including Oppenheimer, the hero. He's very egotistical. He's cocky as hell. He's got a lot of narcissism, kind of a godlike personality. He does have redeeming qualities, but he's certainly not a messiah. He's certainly not perfect, flawless, and he goes through his struggles and his paces, and certainly he does get hit down. Which brings me to the biggest part, and for me, the most exciting part, which I don't think any other person is going to nerd out on. I'll see if anybody on the internet nerds out about this. But I was so into the legal drama in this film. So this is not a huge spoiler, but there's two different processes, kind of semi-legal processes, that I want to get into that are so important and part of this. So there's an administrative hearing and there's a congressional hearing. And the important thing about both of those, from a lawyer standpoint, and hear me nerding and fanboying out over here, is the fact that they point out in both the congressional hearing and in the administrative hearing that there's no burden of proof and that it isn't a trial. Why is this so important in both the administrative context and the congressional hearing? We are seeing now in Congress, we've seen multiple hearings for the last 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, so many hearings where there hasn't been a burden of proof, a standard of proof, where they're just introducing things and witnesses and taking testimony without any pushback, without any counterweight. They can just kind of do what they want, run roughshod in these congressional hearings. And on the same side, these administrative hearings, they show it in Oppenheimer when they're reviewing his security clearance. They say it. They specifically say this in the movie. They say, we don't have to give his defense counsel, because he's got a defense lawyer who's smart, very smart, but he doesn't have all the materials. They kind of don't give him all the top secret classified stuff. And they say, nope, we're going to keep that because you're not cleared. We are, so we're not giving you the evidence. That is so spot on for even modern day administrative law. The glowies, the alphabet boys, they do this stuff all the time. They say, oh no, well that's top secret, that's classified. We can't judge, we can't turn over the evidence. You just have to trust us when we say we have it. You just have to trust us. They go through the exact same thing in the movie. When they say, well, there's a recording. Can you produce the recording? Can you show them the recording? Well, that's classified. You don't have the clearance for that, sir, Mr. Defense Attorney. And the defense attorney straight up says, this is a kangaroo court. This is a kangaroo court. It's a kangaroo proceeding. And so many Americans in modern day America are going through that in administrative hearings, whether at the state, federal, local level. They're told, hey, it's not a courtroom. We don't have to have a burden of proof. We don't even really have to hear you. We're gracing you by allowing you to speak, or maybe allowing you to have your attorney there. But hey, rules are rules. We went through this with the pandemic. We've gone through this with a lot of the prosecution of individuals that, let's say, they were talking back about what's going on in the classroom. Let's say it was parents that were speaking back and they're removed, right, from school board meetings, or kind of put on a threat list. And for what? We see the FBI agents in Oppenheimer just making up evidence. They're directed by politicians or political lackeys to just make up evidence, to, hey, pin it on this guy. Write a report, give me this recommendation. That is still true today. And what I think the writers didn't realize, because in this dynamic, Oppenheimer in this has, lefty ties. He's kind of a little bit of a lefty. He's more of a left-leaning type of guy. He used to be more of a, never card-carrying. He makes a good point that he never joined the Communist Party. But he had communist sympathies, right? He sympathized with them. He sent money to Spain, but then got away from that, moved away from that as he got into the project and got into helping America. And you kind of see that with him, where they go back and in the McCarthy era, they target that. Well, the role is reversed in modern day America. See, the commies now, well, that's anybody who isn't a commie, right? See, the commies have switched side of the table. They're no longer the people that are being interrogated. They're the interrogators. The commies are the interrogators. And they're going through and putting you through these struggle sessions, these purity tests. And these purity tests are not just going on in administrative hearings and in congressional hearings, although they certainly are going on there. They're also going on in social media. They're going on in corporations. And there is no due process. And there is not a more important thing than due process. This is clearly pointed out by the lawyers and the characters in Oppenheimer, where they just say, hey, look, this is not fair, this is not right. Now, there is justice in the end. I'm not going to give a spoiler for the what happens to Strauss, although it's historical, so you can look that up. But there is kind of justice in the end and the truth winning through. But I think that commitment to truth as part of the American system is so vital and so important. And that's the note that Oppenheimer absolutely hits on the head. So I would definitely recommend that you see this movie. I think it's a 9 out of 10, if not a 9.5 out of 10. Absolutely recommend that you see it. It's hard for me to give out a 10 out of 10. It's hard for me to give out perfection. But definitely recommend you see this and check this out, and avoid Barbie and check out Oppenheimer this weekend. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Take care. Peace.